Hello and welcome to the newest episode of Undisciplined. This is your host, Nico Beitendach. Today we have a very special episode with Johannes Schmidt, project coordinator for the Niklas Luhmann Archiv at Bielefeld University. We will speak about the work that is being done in archiving Luhmann's literary estate in Bielefeld. This wonderful project is coordinated by Johannes. He was also kind enough to host me at the archive for close to a year that just came to an end, and it was a wonderful opportunity for me. Please visit their website where you can access the digital edition of the archive at niklasluhmannarchiv.de. That's Niklas-Luhmann-Archiv, like in English but no E at the end, .de. The intro track is Melatonin by Grada. Please check his page out in the episode description, as well as the archive's website is also in the episode description. Enjoy this episode. Yes, Johannes, thank you for taking the time to talk to me today about your work at the Niklas Luhmann Archive here at Bielefeld University. I always ask people who I speak to first introduce themselves and also their academic background. So in your case, how did you get interested in sociology? What is your academic biography in the field of sociology, and how did you end up being involved with the Luhmann Archiv?
Yeah, thank you first for the possibility to give an interview to you. After high school, I first wanted to become a journalist, and I studied Zeitungswissenschaft at the university in Munich. That's communication science. However, in a seminar on social theory, one of the lecturers gave me the urgent advice to do something with more intellectual appeal, as he put it. So I switched to sociology 2 years later. And when on the first semesters, I attended the introductory lectures on social theory by Walter Bühl. Nobody knows him today, I think. And he goes through all the theories from the classics to the present. And at the end, he handed out a list of literature one should read and buy the books if one is interested in social theory. And of course, I buy the books and Luhmann's Social Systems was on the list as well. And I looked into the book after buying it and simply didn't understand anything I've read at the first time. Okay. And I found it in some form disturbing, and in the other way I found it fascinating, and I want to understand what is said in the book and what these puzzling sentences really mean. But my primary interest at that time was not systems theory, but science, studies of technology and science. And then I moved from Munich to Bielefeld, because in Bielefeld there was a research center for these issues. And when I made the decision to move to Bielefeld, I didn't even know that Luhmann was teaching there and that he was teaching at that time. But of course, as I realized it, I go to his seminars and to his lectures, and was really surprised because the theory was really accessible in these lectures. And Luhmann as a person was, and the theorist was accessible too. And he was with any attitudes. Wow, that was really interesting. And almost all the students interested in Luhmann at this time were students at this research center on science and technology. And we were something of a clique, a conspiratorial group, really eaten up by theory, I think, most of us. And there was some momentum of understanding and discussing the theory, and some sort of intellectual fascination. If you get deeper into the theory at that time as a student, it actually changed the I think the world. Your view of the world really was a different one afterwards. After I finished my studies, I was a project collaborator of Rudolf Stichweh, who was the direct successor on the chair of Niklas Luhmann, and has his doctorate in habilitation under Luhmann in Bielefeld. And especially further developed the concept of World Society of Niklas Luhmann. And at that time, I actually do empirical research with systems theory. Two projects. One was on the legal requirements of non-marital partnership, very special issue at this time. And another was the popularization of science, scientific knowledge through exhibitions. It was an exhibition on genetics in that time. And I moved with Stichwitz to Luzern in Switzerland in 2003. And this was a really small seminar institute in Lucerne, new institute. And this was something like a Bielefeld branch, I would say. Everyone comes from Bielefeld. But it was very nice because there was not the great faculty disturbing with different interests and persons who don't like system theory. So it was very interesting. And then I moved back in 2009 due to family reasons to Bielefeld, and a short time later André Kieserling, who is the successor of the chair of Stichwitz and was the last assistant of Niklas Luhmann, he asked me whether I would like to take over the edition of the literary estate. I then spent, I think, 2.5 years researching to find out what was in this literary estate, and then wrote an application for an editing project, which fortunately was accepted into the academic program in 2015.
Yeah, I find it interesting that you said when you first read Luhmann, on the one hand you don't understand at all, but on the other hand that makes you really want to understand, because that's exactly my experience too. It was the first drive was to try and get the message, unlock what this is about. But this podcast is not specifically a Luhmannian one, so if you don't mind, and this is a very big question, but if we can try to very simply or very shortly, can you give an overview of who Niklas Luhmann was and his theory?
Yeah, I will try. As for his person, Luhmann was born in 1927 in Lüneburg. He was the son of a brewer. That's not very interesting, but that's the fact. And he studied law after World War II for 3 years in Heidelberg, and then first worked as a civil servant in public administration. And this time he really began reading scientific literature, organizational sciences, sociological philosophy. And he wrote in this time a doctoral thesis in law on political consulting. We have the manuscript in the literary estate, 270 pages, almost finished, but didn't submit the thesis because his supervisor has gone into politics and was not any longer at the university. Then he goes to Harvard for 1 year in 1960, still as a senior civil servant in the administration, and studied by Talcott Parsons, the leading sociological theorist at that time in the USA, and representative of functionalist system theory. And then he comes back to Germany and changed sides from administrative practitioner to administrative theorist, became a lecturer at the Verwaltungshochschule Speyer, that's the University of Administrative Science in Speyer, and it's where the scientific training of the administrative employees in Germany takes place. He himself has more theoretical interest than practical interest, and wrote some books in this time, and in 1965 he moved to Dortmund, Sozialforschungsstelle Dortmund. That was the leading social research department in sociology in Germany at that time. It's part of the University of Münster, and received his doctorate in habilitation in 1 year in 1966. The books had been written in 1964 and 1966. The institute was headed by Helmut Schelsky. It's a very prominent figure in German sociology in the 1960s, and was very influential on professional policy in that time. And Schelsky was the one who developed the concept of the Bielefeld University in the 60s, which was founded in 1969. And Luhmann became the first professor at this university in 1968, 1 year before the university actually opens. And he stayed in Bielefeld until his retirement in 1993. Well, his theory it's not so simple to describe. It's one of the grand theories, I would think, in sociology. And he developed a theoretical framework about 40 years. All his academic work in his academic career was on this framework, a theoretical framework. And the intention was to describe every social phenomena you can think of with the same concepts. And he has written 600 publications on a wide range of topics. And everything in the conceptual frame, social system theory. What does it mean? First of all, he had developed a social theory, basic social theory, one could say, to distinguish three types of social systems: interaction, organization, and society. That are the fundamental social systems you can find. And on this background, he developed a theory of society since 1970, and which was completed in 1997, now 7 years later. And this theory describes society as a communication system, internally differentiated in functional subsystems, which themselves are separated in some form, operative, but are working networking worldwide. And within this framework, Luhmann published monographs on all the functional systems, economy, science, art, law, and so on social communication, media, as he puts it. That's, for example, power, trust, or love. But also articles on contemporary issues such as exclusion, the ecological question, or social movements. Well, yes, the theory was prominent from the 1970s, I would say, and discussed, very controversial in sociology and beyond. I think it's particularly remarkable to know that the perception of the theory was not remained to sociology, but a very intensive report of the theory was in humanities, law, theology, literature, media studies, arts, science, political studies, family therapy, for example, educational science, and so on, management, organization science, and philosophy. He was intensively perceived in South America, Spanish-speaking world, in Italy, in Japan, and the last decade in the Anglo-Saxon-speaking world, as well as their publications, translations of the publications. And a major translation program is currently launched in China to translate all the monographs he has written. As we know in the Luhmann Archive, we know there are 28 languages in which Luhmann's books or articles are transcribed.
Great. That was a very excellent overview. Thank you. So you gave us also this background or biography of Luhmann, but he, as far as I understand, he gained his first real public prominence in his debate with the famous philosopher Jürgen Habermas. And this has become a kind of legendary exchange between these two figures.
Yeah.
Do you mind explaining a little bit what the background of the Luhmann-Habermas debate, what it was about, and what the effect of that was?
Yeah. Perhaps one can distinguish between the discussion of content and the impact on the professional politics, I would say.
Sure.
And to start with the later, in the early 70s, Luhmann was a newly appointed professor at a new university, a specialist in administrative science, hardly known beyond this inner circle, I would say. Habermas, as you said, was one of the great figures in this time, although 2 years younger than Luhmann, leading intellectual figure in the 1968 movement. And before the publication of the book, therefore, the roles were clearly divided, I would say. The prominent one and the unknown one could say. And the volume itself, the book itself was a great success, especially in the terms of number of sold books. And it made Luhmann overnight an equal antipode to Jürgen Habermas. What the content is concerned, the title of the book suggested was about the question of critical social theory, that is Habermas, versus a functional description of society, that's Luhmann. In the title, relatively called social technology, or as Habermas puts it, a social cybernetics, which places theory as on the service of existing conditions, conservative theory, as Parsons, for example. At least this was Habermas' view, you must say, who understood his theory as a normative one. Together with this description of the society, also providing an evaluative standard to criticize, to classify the existing condition and to criticize the circumstances and to correct them in some way. Luhmann saw things differently, and his concept of equivalence functionalism in particular was an approach of making visible in his mind the possibilities excluded in the status quo of the society. For him, this was the really critical approach describing the society. In concrete terms, the volume dealt with basic concepts of both theories, meaning, concept of meaning, the concept of communication, of system, of discourse, technique, work, and so on. In terms of the, theoretical history, I would say the volume was history only 2 or 3 years later. Never, it has no there's no, I think there were 2 or 3 or 4, I don't know the exact number, following supplement volumes, but there was not a really tradition of discussion going on in the later 1970s. I might say the relationship between Luhmann and Habermas remains somewhat unclear to me after looking into the literary estate. There was, although there were still regular, more or less regular contacts even after the discussion, there was no real correspondence between the two as I have expected. Luhmann himself probably lost interest in Habermas' theory with the increasing commitment of Habermas to social philosophy, I think. After the publication of Theory of Communicative Action in 1981, I think the theory could hardly be of any interest for him any longer. And when asked in an interview in the mid-80s whether he believed that Habermas also ran a card index like Luhmann, he answered quite disrespectfully, "For this theory, simple criteria of order seems to be sufficient." And I think that's really, yeah. You haven't to comment on this. Yeah.
Luhmann passed away in 1998, and subsequently this Luhmann Archiv has been founded at Bielefeld University. So what do you think is the importance of establishing this archive, and what were or are the challenges that have popped up in doing this? And in complement to that, what are the goals of the archive? What do you and your staff hope to achieve in archiving Luhmann's literary estate?
Yeah. I think Luhmann can without doubt be called the most important German sociologist in this 20th century, perhaps beside Max Weber. And his theory is internationally outstanding. We can compare it with Michel Foucault, Pierre Bourdieu, Jürgen Habermas. But they are different in the concept. And I think in the interdisciplinary connectivity Luhmann's theory has. The literary estate itself makes the Luhmann and his theory building visible, I would say. In Goffman's words, you might know it, it's the backstage, front stage, and backstage distinction. It's the backstage of the theory you are looking on, and if you look into the literary estate. And in terms of the information content beyond the published work, it may only be surpassed in the more recent history of ideas by the estate of Edward Husserl, which is a really big one. And this statement is especially true for the card index, I would say, containing about 90,000 notes. These notes are written between 1951 or 2. We really don't know the exact date, and 1997. And it documents the theoretical development of Luhmann from the beginning on, so that the collection can be understood as his intellectual autobiography, as Rudolf Stichel once puts it. In addition, the card index itself has a specific structure of order, which is interesting from a point of view of history of science, not only a theory of sociology. Additionally, there are some 200 unpublished manuscripts, which are of some interest from the first start of the theory, 50s and 60s, where you can analyze the intellectual roots of the Luhmannian theory, which is often rather hidden in the published work. For example, the Husserlian reception of Luhmann. There are 4 comprehensive versions of the theory of society, which Luhmann produced between 1965 and 1990.
The theory of society was his.
That was his main project all over the years. And you can see in this version the development of the theory as well. Well, I think in the view of the importance of the theory in the history of thought, it appeared to be an obligation to make it accessible to the public. It's no question. And made it accessible in an appropriate manner. That means you have to think about how to publish it, not only as print, but also a digital version. And especially the card index is something which is really appropriate to be published in a digital version. It's I think you can say this is digital humanity is at its best if you publish it as a hypertext, because the card index is some sort of hypertext. Also, it wasn't published digital, wasn't written in digital version by Luhmann himself. So it's a very good choice to do it this way, I think.
Okay, so very broadly, do you mind explaining what you mentioned, the different versions of the theory of society and the card index, but slightly more broadly, what does the archive contain? And after beginning the process of archiving his estate, were there any surprising finds?
Well, yeah, I think there are 4 sections in the literary estate. There's the card index, there are manuscripts, the working library of Luhmann, and the correspondence. And the card index is the central component, I would say, of the literary estate. It's not very big. If you look at it first, you're really disappointed. It's 27 drawers, each containing about 3,000 notes, handwritten notes, undated notes in Octavo format. That means 90,000 notes, as I've told. And there are 2 collections, one from 1951 to 1963, with about 23,000 notes, and from 1963 to 1997 with about 67,000 notes. 5,000 cards are notepads in the strictly sense, and the others are biographical notes and keyword index and some special other special departments. The manuscripts, there are about 3,000 manuscripts in the estate, but not only unpublished manuscripts. There are only about 200, I would say. The others are earlier or final versions of previous published texts we do have. And there are about 28 lecture notes, very interesting lecture notes especially from the beginning of Luhmann's career at the university. and about 500 talk notes he gave over the years from 1966 to 96. And the main unpublished manuscripts are from the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, and some are from the 1990s, which he hadn't finished because of his health circumstances. They are from different fields of theory: social theory, societal theory, administrative and organizational science, and theory of education. The working library is comparatively small. Yeah. He read mostly in libraries all over the world and not at home. And he once said in an interview that he makes confirmations to conferences less dependent on the topic of the conference itself, but on the whether there's an interesting library nearby he can visit during the conference. So his library is in some way it's disappointing. If you have thought of tons of books from all the science fields you can think of. It contains about 10 or 11,000 titles, but they're not only books, but articles, journal articles, book articles, and so on. And there are hardly any editing notes in the books or on the articles. No one always make notes only on cards, not in the books and not on the articles when reading. The correspondence is about 9,000 index units, but there is no really interesting or extensive correspondence with any person. The one or two exceptions: Karl Ebert Shaw, it's an educational scientist from Hamburg, in which Luhmann worked for quite a long time. That was a really exception. He normally doesn't work with anyone but himself. And Sepp Gumbrecht, you may know, this Stanford literary scientist who wrote many letters to Luhmann, but Luhmann doesn't wrote so much letters to Gumbrecht. I think I was surprised by perhaps by 3 points. First, the strong orientation of Luhmann towards Husserl in the beginning of his scientific studies, his social studies. His first monographical manuscript, General Theory, from the 1960s, is titled Phänologische Studien für Soziologie, in English, Studies in Phenomenological Sociology. And Luhmann, in this manuscript, Luhmann attempted to combine two traditions. On the one hand, the transcendental theory of Husserl, in which Husserl had encountered the intersubjective constitution of the world and meaning, and on the other hand, sociological functionalism, Malinowski, Parsons, and so on. And Luhmann's proposal was to look for the function of society at approximately the same place where the transcendental subject in Husserl's theory takes his place. And with a little exaggeration, one can say that Luhmann's concept of the world society comes directly or indirectly from Husserl's life world concept. Secondly, the number of the independent versions of the theory of society was surprising, I think. We all have known that Luhmann has worked lifelong on this topic. But the fact that there was at least 3 extensive and completed versions of the theory from the 70s, 80s, and the 90s, each of them were really new versions and no credible reversions, was new to us. Luhmann himself apparently wrote them as a kind of theoretical self-understanding, I would say, not for publishing. They might have been published, but first of all, it was some sort of thinking about what he's doing in this time. And due to the modifications in his general theory, he put them aside in order to start all over again with a new version, without questioning the basic concepts, but with a radical new version of the theory. And thirdly, as I've just said, the surprise was concerning the unproductiveness of the correspondence in scientific terms. It's trivial letters. I cannot come to your conference. You have to pay my room in the hotel and something like this. Whereas here's my flight ticket, and so on. And nothing really interesting, except one thing is the papers called Notizen zum Erziehungssystem, notes on the education system, that are notes he exchanged with Karl Ebert Shaw, I've mentioned, the educational scientists. There are about 1,100 notes from the mid of the 1970s to the mids of the 1980s. And it's a document of their discussion on educational science in this time.
Interesting. To go back to something that you already mentioned, you mentioned his famous note card system, or the Titelkasten, and that you said that from the 1950s until his death, he was developing this way of organizing his research, and you said that now you are digitizing all of it and that it lends itself very well to hypertext and links and so on. Do you mind explaining a little bit more how this note card or index card system of him worked and what makes it so special and unique?
Well, that's a very difficult question to answer in a short way, but I will try. In the mid-1950s, before Luhmann had any institutional affiliation to science, he began reading, as I've told, and writing notes, and he was already conscious of the fact that he are not writing notes for one book he will now write, but it will be a greater project, eventually a lifelong project. And the common methods of organizing notes in folders or something like that would be inefficient. So he started the card-based filing system. We really don't know where he has the idea from. There's no self-description where he said, the idea comes from one of the scientists in the 19th century, for example, where the idea was relatively prominent, but not in the design Luhmann chose then. The bulk of the collections consist of notes, I've told. Results of Luhmann's reading, but only as well thoughts of himself and arguments and concepts he just developed. But the notes he made during reading was some sort of excerpts, but they are not notes for the Zettelkasten itself. He made them in the evening after coming home, and he was reading the books, as he said, with a view of what could be used for the Zettelkasten, not what is the message of the book itself, but what can I do with it, looking at the notes I already had in my index card. Furthermore, his main concern was not to develop an idea to maximum sophistication before putting it into the Zettelkasten, but he operated on the assumption that the decision of the usefulness or the content of a note could only be in relating it to other notes and read it some time later. And the content of the note and the innovativeness of a note could only be decided in the future and not at the time he really writes the note. Furthermore, that was not clear when writing the note where it should be inserted into the collection. And normally there were more than one possible place to put it. And that's the main idea of the collection, to put it to be some sort of living organism. Yeah, and in detail there are 4 special characteristics which makes this thing working. I would say, first of all, a specific system of organization and method of card integration, corresponding specific rules of numbering, an internal system of linking, as I've said, hyperlinks, and comprehensive word keyword index. All this together makes Luhmann's card index a complex cognitive system, as he said. Secondary memory, he once said. And I would say a few words to all the 4 points I've mentioned. First, the method of card integration. According to Luhmann himself, the card collection is a combination of order and disorder, as he put it, a clustering and unpredictable combination emerging from ad hoc selection. That's his words. But of course, the collection is not a simple chaotic compilation of notes, but it's an aggregation of a vast number of cards on specific concepts and topics on the first view. But it's a specific system of organization of the notes which is applied within these sections, which is the interesting point. The point is that the initial decision for a specific topic or a specific issue did not lead to a sequence of cards confined to that one topic only. Whenever Luhmann came across an interesting idea about a secondary aspect on one of his cards, he pursued this idea by adding additional notes on this topic and inserted the respective card at that place in the existing sequence of notes. This method could be applied again to the card that had been inserted and so forth. The result being a sequence of cards leading away, conceptually and thematically away from the first theme, the initial subject of the section in which the thing starts. This technique enables the collection to grow, not only in number, but inwards in complexity, I would say, without limitations of systematic order. You normally have as well in normal index cards and normal Zettelkasten. But the position of the larger subject areas as well as the individual cards is not only the historical product of Luhmann's reading interests, it's also the result of the, as I've said, difficulty to assign an issue to one and one only single subject or concept. It's a matter of ambiguity, one could say, or conceptual indecisiveness. And Luhmann solved this problem by seeing it as not as a problem, but as an opportunity. You can put one card in different places of the collection, and every place is adequate. You choose. There is no wrong place. And the rationality to decide where to put a card is only a local one. It's a local solution. The card has to be connected with the card before. That's the only rationality you have to take in mind if you insert a new card. That means the position of a special subject or a special card does nothing say about the theoretical importance of the card. There is no bottom and there's no top in the collection itself. That's the first point. The second point, the system of numbering. To get this compilation and these numbers of cards to speak to you, you have to have a possibility to address each card individually to find it again, because there is no overall systematical structure you can use. So the idea and the solution is a specific number system or a notational system. Each card gets a number and thus a fixed position in the collection. It's really simple, but it works very well. The first card you are noting, the first note you are writing gets the number 1, and the second the number 2. And the third one, the argument goes on, number 3. And then you find an interesting point on card number 1, which doesn't really fix in the argument from 1 to 2. And then you write a note and on this special issue and put it between card number 1 and card number 2, and the number 2 is not available, and so you have to get another number, and that is simply 1A, and you put it in between 1 and 2, and then you can go on the second argument, and that in the following note is 1A, 1B, and again you can on 1A you can follow a new argument, and that is 1A1. And that goes on 1A1, 1A2, and so on and so forth. And you see how this works. And at the end, you have numbers with, 12, 14 digits at the end. The third principle is the system of linking, as I've said. That's another, I think, that's a key feature of the collection as well. There is no systematical order, and so there are different places where notes on the same subject or subjects which have something to do with the first one can be found, and you have to link them. That's the term, the exact term. And so Luhmann puts notes, writes the number of another node on a node which is in some way related to the first one. around about, I think we have around about 50,000 references of this kind throughout the collection. And there are especially two types of references: single references, where he only puts one number of a node into the text he just have written. So to make a shortcut, as network theoreticals would say, network analysis would say, to get to another place where an argument which is of interest can be found. And the second sort of references are collective references that are at the beginning of thematical sections. You often find a card with only a number of references, only up to 25 different references, different numbers of nodes, of other nodes. In a network theoretical term, that's some sort of hub. From this point, you can get to many other points in the collection. In the Corona times, you're talking about super spreader. That's exactly the same mechanism. If you find this node with 25 references, you find everything in the collection which has to do with the theme you are just looking at. And if you compare this with the internet, you see it's some sort of hyperlink. And it was developed in the 1950s. Yeah. So there were no personal computers, only the big companies do have some sort of very slow working computers at that time. So that was very innovative, I would say. And the fourth principle is the keyword index. That is the central key. So it's the right word, keyword index, in a double sense. You don't have a table of contents in the collection because it always changes its content. You can't really write a table of contents, and there's no systematic order, so it's can't be written. So you have to use a keyword index to find anything in the collection, and Luhmann created permanently keyword index. There are different versions of a keyword index. After some time, we write a new one because the old one cannot be read any longer. And we have about 4,350 entries in the last version of the keyword index. And contrary to a normal keyword index or subject index in a book, it does not claim to provide a complete list of all the nodes combined with a special keyword. But Luhmann rather notes 1 to 3 numbers. And the idea was that you can find all the other nodes by using the links on the nodes you find. Well, that are the essential principles of the index of the Zettelkasten. Although there's one thing that should not be ignored, and that is Niklas Luhmann, I think. The box could be only be productive because Luhmann was the author and the user, and he was within it like a fish underwater, I would say. He knows where every nodes are. There were no descriptions on the front of the Zettelkasten. No numbers on the front, but he knows which drawer to take out to find number 7/25A. I don't know the exactly number. But he really knows where to look at.
Oh, that's incredible. So at the archive, several of his unpublished manuscripts have, in the meantime, been published publicly. How was the decision made to publish certain manuscripts, and especially if one considers that Luhmann himself decided not to publish something? So on what basis are such decisions taken, and what are some examples of things that have been published?
Yeah, first of all, most of the work is still ahead of us. We have just published one big book, but beside of this, we will certainly publish 1 or 2 more versions of the theory of society. The phonological writings, the early writings I've told about. Very large manuscript on educational system, very interesting book. A smaller one, administration, from the 1960s, and probably several lecture notes from the 1960s. And it's the first time at the University of Münster where he gave his first lectures. And conceptualize his program that will be followed the next decades. And of course, a larger number of essays and articles. The theory of society versions are interesting, as I've told, because they are a document of the development of the theory itself. The concept was established in the 1960s, the overall concept of the design of the theory, but the content differs between the different decades. And it's a sort of documentation of the theory development as well as the card index, I would say. Yeah? But it's the official side of theory development, not the backstage. And like the card index, the phenomenological essay, early writings show the great importance of Edmund Husserl, which was really stunning and is in some form hidden in the official publication. If you read Social System from 1984, there is a chapter on meaning, but if you look at the name Husserl, it's hard to find the name. But it's the influence of the Husserl thinking is really is dominant. And as I've told, the large manuscript in education system from the 70s fills a blank space, I think, in Luhmann's writing. There is a version from the 1990s, published in 2002 posthum, but this was only a first draft. Luhmann hadn't finished the book. And this was in some way unsatisfactory, especially because Luhmann has a very intensive discourse with educational scientists from the 1970s over the 1980s to the 1990s, mediated particularly by Carl Eberhard Shaw, the educational scientist, with whom he also planned the book. This book, that's one of these cases where he planned a book with a co-author. He published one book with Shaw in 1979, Reflexionsprobleme des Erziehungssystems, Reflection Problems of the Educational System, I think is the English title. But that might be a result of the collaboration on the bigger book, which was not published. We don't know because why it wasn't published. But the question, of course, remains, why do we publish manuscripts, material that Luhmann didn't? The question itself is especially justified because Luhmann, up from the 1970s on, I would say, all the texts he starts writing were published afterwards. He doesn't write and put it aside. Every manuscript is finished and published. And for some manuscripts, essay manuscripts in the 1990s, that's not the case. Because of health reasons, he can't really finish them. But these texts are not really unfinished, I would say. They are because Luhmann has a special technique in revising manuscripts. The first version he writes is something you could publish. It's in some form. It's ready to be published, and they are complete, but not really finished, I would say, because Luhmann in the second or third version puts new passages into an existing manuscript, new parts. As in the Zettelkasten, he inserts and he uses the same number technique. You have page number one and page number 2, and then you find in the second version 1A, B, C, and so on. So the texts are complete in a certain way, but they are not finished. In contrast, the texts in the beginning of his career in the 1960s, especially the monographs, they are not completed as a whole. They are in some way they had started with 1 or 2 or 3 chapters and then put them aside. We really don't know why. Because the development of his theoretical thinking has overtaken himself while writing the books, and that's precisely our interest lies in this case, as we want to document the beginning of this theory.
Thank you. So the archive has been going for a few years now, but the work is not complete. So what still lies in the future that needs to be done in the archive itself? And then more broadly speaking, from your particularly interesting position, how do you see the legacy of Luhmann's work in theory or in academia in general?
to your second question, it's difficult to answer. I think the time of the super or grand theories is over. It's seems to be clear. One can even go so far to say that Luhmann is one of the last representatives, I would say, of this sort of theory. What currently dominates in sociology is time agnostic descriptions, I would say, of society. And these you can see quite clearly the problem that is connected with these middle range theories, as one would say. They are focusing on a structural feature of one structural feature of society that supposedly dominates the whole society. And I think in this way they are reducing the complexity of society to an inadequate minimum, 1 point. And they usually do so without an overall concept of society, and which could justify why exactly this feature should be so dominant. And this is the reason why they can claim that everything is new in this society they are living in normally. And in this respect, I think a theory like Luhmannian theory is some sort of an indicator of what such middle range theories can actually achieve, because they have the overall picture of society, which you can discuss if the description of society as functionally differentiated is adequate nowadays. But I haven't found any description up to nowadays which convinced me that it is not the case. The internet makes some difference, of course, but we always differentiate between society, economy and science and art and law and so on. There's a communication technique which is used by the functional systems, but they use them as functional systems and nothing else. So I would say that such a form of theory which looks on the society as a whole is really necessary for the discipline, for sociology. And I think there's no doubt of the importance of the concept of world society, which is made prominent by Luhmann first. That's not globalization, it's a different thing. And I think the actual development of this society is some sort of proof of this concept. Everything is connected to everything else in the world, function differentiated. That's a very interesting concept. I think what one must protect the theory from is a purely schematic use of the conceptual apparatus. You have the tendency in systems theoretical literature to look after new functional systems, for example, military or something like that Luhmann has not yet described, or to look at some new types of systems, groups, for example, network is another example, and then put on the start button and the theory, the conceptual machine begins to work. And that's not really an interesting form of literature, I would say, because you already know what is the result of the description.
It's not adding to the theory.
It's nothing new. It's not really. Then it's not innovative in some sense. They're just doing what Luhmann has not done.
Yeah.
But that's all. And I think in this concept I think it's interesting to see that the late Luhmann has this tendency too, I would say, especially after using the concepts of George Spencer's Brown about medium and form, and Haider and the concept of observation. And these last books from the 1990, 92 on, I think are a little bit concept orientated, and they are less sociologically innovative as compared with the books from the 1970s especially. That was real sociology, I would say. And in the last years, it was some sort of doing the program.
Thank you. So we're coming towards the end. So for people who want to find out more about the work that you are doing at the archive and have access to the archive, where can they find all of this information?
Yeah, since 1.5 years, spring 2019, we have an own internet portal, Niklas Luhmann Archiv.de, where we present the estate holdings and give information about the work and the person This content is rather small at the moment, but will continuously expand over the years. And at the moment, the digital holdings are still dominated by the card index. We put a very great deal of work, including technical work. I think 2.5 or 3 years we are working on the technique and the conceptual framework for the internet presentation of the card index into the navigation and the search options and so on, to ensure that the collection is actually readable in a form Luhmann hasn't the opportunity to in the analogous form of the Zettelkasten. In the future, I hope we will publish a transcription and a digitalization of a new drawer every 6 months. That would mean that we finish the first collection in 2023 and the second in 2030. That's the end of our project. It's a long time, but just need the time to do the job. And we are now beginning to digitize the manuscripts and we will put them in facsimiles online in the medium part from next year on, I think, 2021. Partly as supplements to print publications we will do, and partly also exclusively. First versions, for example, or the talk notes will be only presented on the portal. In addition, I will add a complete overview of the library, of Luhmann's library, which, as I've said, is not of such interest. And we have offer a list of his works and a complete bibliography, which is now has about 2,300 entries, all the different publications in original Germany and translations in different languages.
Yeah, I think, and definitely I will put a link of that in the episode description.
Thanks.
Yeah, I really hope many people look at that, and I think the work is really essential. It will be useful for many, many years, I'm convinced. So thank you also to you and your colleagues and your team for doing this work. Not everyone can come to Bielefeld.
Yes,
so
that's right, yeah.
This is a very important contribution. So just to finish off on a kind of a lighter note, do you also, as someone who, as you said, you attended seminars of Luhmann and so on, do you have any personal favorite anecdotes about Niklas? And because he is a person whose private life is not so well known perhaps as other thinkers, so I'm sure it would be very interesting to hear some stories that you personally like.
Yeah, from my own experience, I can say that Luhmann was extremely polite, but also extremely distanced type of person. You really don't know him personally. You can't get in touch with him. But he does not make much trouble about his person. Also, he was a celebrity in sociology, I would say. And there are two things that come to my mind. In his seminars, and especially in his colloquia in the evening, there were often people who made contributions that were really difficult to understand. They were in some sort strange and simply nonsensical in some way. But Luhmann let them finish with an almost, I would say, Asian-like politeness. He sits there and doesn't make a face. And when they are finished, he liked to say, of course you can do it that way, but I would prefer to start with a different distinction. That was a typical statement, which means in the subtext is devastating criticism. And then he talks about another thing in the following minutes. That was typical for Luhmann. Not offensive, very polite, but clear in the message for those who could get the message. Another example of this very special kind takes place in his farewell lecture in February 1993, which was attended by a huge crowd, several hundred people in the Audimax in the university. And as is customary in such occasions, there were first the official speeches, a greeting from the rector of the university, and then from the dean of the faculty of sociology, Ottheim Ramstedt. Now, it is important to know that Luhmann was acquainted with Ottheim Ramstedt for about 25 years at this time. Ramstedt was already one of his colleagues in Münster at the beginning of his academic career, and it was his first assistant in Bielefeld for 2 years in the beginning of the 1970s. And Ramstedt himself, who published all the works of Georg Simmel, I want to say, Ramschitz himself was not a great speaker, which was one of the reasons why his speech was a bit exhausting as well for him as well as for the audience. But after only a few minutes, 4 or 5 minutes, thing was over. And then Luhmann went to the desk, but didn't thank Ramstedt politely for the warm words, as one have expected. He just said, I would say it in German first, nach so viel umständlichen Vorbereitungen kommen wir jetzt zur Sache. What in the translated means, after so much cumbersome preparation, we now come to the point. It's some form of unpoliteness, I would say. And the point, of course, was his lecture with a really beautiful title, What is the Case and What is Behind it? Was ist der Fall und was liegt dahinter? And you can listen to the lecture and the very special prologue in our portal.
Thank you very much, Johannes Schmidt.
Yeah, thank you.